What's up folks, Captain Blade J52 here, and for this video we're going to be taking a look at our Tier 6 Galaxy X Dreadnought, otherwise known as the Yamato Dreadnought Cruiser. Now, really quickly, for those people that aren't familiar with the Galaxy X and may be wondering, well, what is this ship? Why do we have it in-game? The Galaxy X wasn't on screen for very much time, but it was the 3 nacelled Galaxy class or Enterprise that came to rescue Captain Picard and the other survivors of the Pasteur and the future timeline that Captain Picard experienced. So it was, in fact, on screen, if but for a brief time, and a lot of people liked it. A lot of people wanted to see, well, as far as Star Trek Online goes, a lot of people wanted to see the ship in-game, and we actually have it. Now, I do think the Yamato improved on the old T5 or T5U design quite a bit, and it actually made the ship a lot better in my opinion. Now, one of the big draws to the Galaxy X, and a big reason a lot of people liked it, is because of that Spinal lance that absolutely shreds enemy ships. Now, we actually have that in-game as one of the abilities of the ship. It's a 45-degree cone. You can see bits of the cone that lit up out there, and whenever you press the button, it'll fire the lance twice, and if it hits the target, it can be a very devastating attack, especially when used at the right time. Now, there's a couple of downsides to the lance, one of which is you can't rapid fire it like you can on the show, though that's kind of to be expected. The other one is that it can sometimes miss the target. It doesn't do it often, at least that I've seen, but it can in fact miss. Whether that's supposed to be the case or not, I don't know. I could have swore I read some patch notes, several years ago that says it's not supposed to be able to now, but that is something to kind of keep in mind at the moment. But otherwise, like I say, it's fun, and if it hits, it can, and if you use it at the right time, it's a very devastating attack. Now, I'm not actually using the standard visuals for this particular ship. I'm using, if the camera will cooperate, the Tier 4, I believe it's a Tier 4, for the special Venture variant of the Galaxy class that they have in-game. That's the neck of it there. And I believe this is the standard Galaxy type deflector, more of a standard Galaxy type of saucer, and then I want to believe these are the Yamato nacelles, if I'm not mistaken. Like I said, it's been a while since I actually put this particular ship costume together, so I don't remember exactly all of the parts that I used, but I'm sure some of the Space Barbies out there in the community will be able to break that down better for you guys. Now, I wanted to go over this ship in particular because a lot of people have started noticing some different skins, updated skins and textures whenever they've been going over to Tribble. They've started to notice this happening. So it looks like we're due for some new skins that are going to be hopefully coming to holodeck pretty soon. A lot of people have started to notice that. We've now, at the time of recording this, got the blog for our new anniversary ship that's going to be coming up here pretty quick. And usually, whenever they do revamps of stuff like this, we usually get some extra stuff, like C-Store packs and stuff with it. I hope they come out with some stuff like that. We're going to see what they do with it, I guess. But, anyways, for this particular ship, like I say, that's part of why I wanted to go over it, to highlight some of the hero ships, or at least this one in particular, and because I hadn't really done a build on it for quite some time, if I even remember doing one at all. So, yeah, but anyway, for our Galaxy X, or our Yamato Dreadnought, now I'm using the fleet version for this particular video, and you guys can see here, I'll go ahead and pull this up. It actually gets, I believe it's a 4th tactical console is what it gets for the fleet variant. The actual trait that comes with the ship, let me scroll down here, is the subsystem redundancies. Basically, whenever you use a beam enhancement, such as shield repair, a beam overload, or a lance type of ability, we get some shield regeneration and shield resistance. So, it can be an okay trait. I think there's better, but it is something that could be decent, especially with some of the overload builds out there today. But getting into some of the other abilities of the ship itself. We have two cruiser commands here, one of which is attract fire, the other is the weapon system efficiency. Now, for my tanks out there, you're probably going to be using attract fire most of the time, because that's going to be an extra 100% threat generation for free. It's also going to be some extra damage reduction for you in the form of damage negation. So that's probably the one you're going to use most of the time. The other one is weapon system efficiency, which cuts the weapon power cost for yourself and allies by 25% while it's active. So if you're in a situation where you know you don't need the extra threat and you don't need the extra benefits of attract fire, you have the weapon system efficiency to draw from, which can produce extra threat. So you only have two of the normal cruiser commands, but they give you the two best ones in my personal opinion. Now, getting into our actual ship. For the Mastery package, you can see here it's the Rapid Repairs. Enhanced Hull Plating for some free damage reduction to energy and radiation. Devastating Weaponry for some free critical chance. The Armored Hull for some hit points. And then the final one from the C-Store variant would be, of course, the Subsystem Redundancies trait. Now, fleet versions only get the first four, because it's assumed if you're buying a fleet version generally that you've purchased the C-Store version first. So therefore you're going to have access to the trait and any special consoles it may have, but that's the one thing as far as that goes. Now, getting into our gear and our setup. Since you have a built-in weapon in the form of the phaser lance on the ship, I wanted to do a build that would take advantage of that and let us draw from it already. So, in my opinion, if you want to get the most out of a Galaxy X Dreadnought, you're probably going to load it with phaser, so you can take advantage of that lance. Now, you don't have to load it with phaser, but that's generally what I prefer to do with ships like that, is to match the given energy type. That way I can take advantage of yet another tool that the ship gives you. So first off, it's a 4-4 layout for weapons, and then it has 5 engineering, 2 science, 4 tacticals, and 1 hangar bay for our setup. So let's go ahead and get into our gear. Now, first up, we have our Prolonged Engagement Phaser. You used to be able to get this, I believe this came out of a Kobayashi Maru event, or you can now pick it up from the Phoenix box for 1 very rare token, so not too terribly hard to get. Now, one of the draws of this phaser is that over time, as you're in the middle of a fight, it's going to buff itself up and hit a little bit harder than a standard phaser is going to do. So it's going to buff its own firing cycle haste in that regard. Now, it does start off doing slightly less than a normal phaser, but once it gets buffed up and going, it tends to be a very hard-hitting phaser in my opinion. Now, the next phaser that we have up front is our Terran Task Force Beam. Now, one of the reasons I wanted to pick this up is it's the alternate energy type to the Terran Task Force Disruptor. It's going to give you the extra radiation damage, and it's going to increase in damage as the target's hull decreases. So you can see the little tooltip there. And it could be a pretty potent weapon in its own right, so that's one reason I wanted to pick this particular phaser up. Then some of the other weapons we have are 2 of our pulse phasers. Now, I wanted to have 2 of our pulse phasers on here because of what they're going to give to us as a tank. You're going to buff yourself for 10 damage resistance, but also debuff the enemy for 10 damage resistance. So essentially, you're going to leech a bit of damage reduction from your foes. They're going to take extra damage, you're going to take less damage for yourself. Now, the final 3 phasers we have are 3 of the advanced phasers from the Discovery Constitution, or perhaps with the D7. Maybe you got it from the D7 unlock as well. It just depends. In this case, we have the Constitution that we got them from. Now, I realize not everybody's going to have access to the advanced phaser beams, but if you do have access to them, they're very potent beams, they're very good. If you don't have access to them and you're interested in using the build, then some other alternatives may be the sensor linked or targeting linked for the benefits they give that are static. There's also, heck, you could even use standard fleet phasers if you wanted to, or standard crafted phasers. Point being, you do have options, and I can help you guys adjust the build accordingly if need be. Now for the advanced phasers, if you do have access to them, I'm using 3 of them on here, and for each one, whenever they proc, you get a 10% critical severity buff to the advanced beams for 15 seconds, and that benefit is going to scale by 10% up to a 60% maximum for as many of the beams as you have. In this case, I'm using 3 of them, therefore I'm going to get a 30% buff. Now you can see the extra little bit talking about crit severity. That's one of our doffs that we're going to look at in just a minute. Now for the final weapon we have on the ship, and this is up front, is our Dark Matter Quantum Torpedo. Now the Dark Matter Quantum is a very nasty little piece of work from the Discovery rep, and when paired with our Lorcus console, you get a very, very nice set bonus out of it. Now for this particular torpedo, it hits like a truck anyway, and you also get the Dark Matter Dissolution, which can do extra damage whenever you're, or do extra stacks of the debuff whenever you crit the target. I was getting a little confused there. So it hits hard already, and it gives you a secondary ability to generate damage. So, yeah, very, very hard-hitting weapon. Now that's what we have for our weapons loadout. We'll take a look at some of our set bonuses in just a minute for our weapons, especially our Lorca 2-piece. Now, getting into our shields, engines, deflector, and warp core. I know I feature the Kobali set and maybe Soul Defense quite a bit here on the channel. That's because they are very potent sets for tanking. However, there are other viable options out there. And I'm still working on the tanking table for you guys to kind of show where I would rate each individual set in the different categories. And the Iconian set is one step below the Kobali in terms of the category I would place it. However, because there's so much flexibility in the tanking realm, even a lower tiered tanking set can be a viable choice when compared to a higher tier set. And in some instances, can actually be the better choice than the higher tiered set, due to things such as avoiding ability bloat, or similar types of things. Now getting into our Iconian set. Now this set excels at giving some good damage reduction, but also lending some benefits to threat generation. Now it's not going to give you a lot in the way of damage recovery, which is why it's a lower tier on the table than our Kobali set, but it is still a viable choice for tanks, which just means in the case of this set, you're going to have to pick up your damage recovery elsewhere. Now looking at our shields. Now I re-rolled the Epic mod to a Res All, and that's to in part take advantage of the already built-in Res All mod that we had. Now the shield came with a reduces all energy damage to shields by 15%. And whenever I re-rolled the Epic modifier, I picked up an additional 10% from that. So that's one good thing that I do like. Now, one of the draws for the Iconian set back in the day, and to some limited extents perhaps today even, is the hot restart that it has on the shields. And it automatically removes shield disabled conditions, can only occur once every 60 seconds. Now, back in the day, before the changes to hot restart were made, this was a constant thing. Anytime your shields got knocked offline by some type of effect, such as maybe an Iconian effect, or an Intel power, or something similar, this would bring your shields back up right away. It would just, boom, your shields are down for a second, boom, they're back up. There you go. Then the other thing that it does is it removes one debuff from you every 10 seconds. So it's got some debuff cleansing for you. It also has a pretty large damage reduction to the shields whenever you reroll that Epic modifier. So the shields on their own definitely have some value. Now, moving along to the warp core. Now, the warp core itself is a hyper injection core, and on its own, I think it's kind of a generic warp core. It's not bad by any stretch of the means. It's still a great core, but we have it's an amp core, and then we have the standard weapon to shield modifier on there. So, or for whenever it hits the epic tier. So it's an okay core, I guess, in that regard. Then it also has a hot restart for your weapons. Now, this was one of the biggest draws of the Iconian core back in the day, and why a lot of people used to run it is because of that. So that's one of the big things that you do have. Now, you can see you do get some limited bits of hull regeneration and shield regeneration whenever you're at full impulse. It's very minute benefits, so not really a lot to it. Now, it also has some warp core efficiency on there as well, but otherwise is essentially a generic core in my opinion. Now, the real strength of the core, especially in today's game, is the fact that it's part of the set. And otherwise, for me, if I'm looking for just a singular warp core, there's better choices out there than this core. But it's still a good core. It's still a good core to have, especially when taking into account the full set. Now, for these engines here, they're hyper impulse engines. Again, I think they're kind of generic, except for the benefit that they have when you're at full throttle. When at 100% throttle, you gain 10.6 energy damage resistance rating. So if you're at full throttle, which could very well happen a good bit as a tank, you're going to get free energy damage resistance just by having these on the build. So they're made to help reduce damage. But otherwise, in my opinion, they're just essentially a set of generic engines. Now, on its own, the Iconian deflector falls into that same category in my opinion. I tend to think most primary deflectors are basically just stat sticks. What you see is what you get. That's not to say they're bad deflectors by any means. It's just, aside from granting stats or being part of sets, they don't really do anything else for you. Now, for the Iconian deflector, I've not rolled anything on this one. You can see it gives a nice chunk of kinetic damage resistance rating, gives some shield restoration, some shield and hull capacity, which is nice, and then the big strength is the scientific readiness that it's going to give. Now, that's going to stack with any readiness you may have and reduce cooldowns for your science powers. So that could be perhaps a control power if you have a gravity well, could be a damage reducing power or a damage recovery type of power. It just really depends on what you're looking for in your toolkit. Now, if you wanted something that could give you extra damage negation, especially in the form of kinetic damage, and also pick up some cooldown reduction, this is the deflector you might consider. Now, I don't know what everybody's going to be doing out there, but this is one that if I was looking for a singular piece, I would keep in mind. Now, with that said, the strength of the Iconian set is in the set bonuses that it gives. Let's go ahead and take a look at those, then we'll take a look at our devices and consoles. Now, for the two-piece bonus, you get the Distribute Shields. It applies a bit of shield regeneration for 5 seconds to each facing. Once triggered, goes on a 30-second cooldown. And the amount of shield healing that it's going to give you is going to be dependent on your shield restoration ability. So the number you see here may be slightly more than mine, it may be slightly less. It's just going to depend on where you're at with your shield restoration. The next thing you have is the 3-piece bonus, and when firing energy weapons, it's a 5% chance to give a stacking Cat 1 10% energy weapon damage buff to your team. So that can go as high as 30%, which is roughly equivalent of a tactical console that you're getting for free. Then you have the 4-piece bonus, and this was the biggest draw of the Iconian set back in the day. Now, for this particular set bonus, it's on a 2-minute recharge. Whenever you activate it, it's plus 33% all damage, 20% maximum hull, and 10% flight speed, I almost said turn rate, for 30 seconds. Now, if I am not mistaken, this used to be a Category 2 buff instead of a Category 1. So, it was a very potent set in the defensibility department, but also in what it could grant you in terms of offense. Now, whenever the big rebalance of Season 13 hit, it did get changed to a Category 1, I believe is when that came in. Now, it's still viable, it's still a good set, it's still a good 4-piece, but it's not as strong as it was before. But it is something that can, in fact, give you additional threat generation as a tank. So you do have options with your weapons and such. Now, as far as your device slots go, you have 4 of them on this particular ship. And as far as devices go, I like to think of them as personal preference. There is no right or wrong answers as to what you can have on the ship. However, some of the ones I like to use are the red matter capacitor. That's going to give you some nice power levels. And you can get that from the Phoenix boxes for fairly easy now. Energy amplifiers for the Cat 2 energy damage buffs they're going to give you. Temporal negotiator for the bridge officer cooldown reduction it's going to give you. And then something like deuterium surplus or Jevonite hardpoints. It really depends on what you're going to have available to you. And I actually forgot to put some deuterium surplus on when I recorded the Japori run, and our Beta Thoradar you're going to see in a couple of minutes here. So I have them on the ship now at least. Now for our engineering consoles, science and tactical. Actually, let's go ahead and do tactical first because I think that's going to be the easiest to explain. So we have 3 vulnerability exploiters. Now these also come from the Spire, and these ones in particular are going to buff our phaser damage, but also grant 9.8% critical severity for each console. So we're getting nearly an additional 30% crit severity off of just having these consoles on the ship. Now, if you have a high enough crit chance, that's when you want to start looking at buffing your severity. Once you've got your crit chance in a good place, you want to buff your severity so that when you do crit, you're hitting for a lot harder than you otherwise normally would. Now for this particular build, just resting at the moment, I'm sitting at 25.8% critical chance and 174.3% severity. Now, truthfully, if I wanted to, I could probably drop just a little bit more of that crit chance off and try to buff for severity and be fine. Now, I don't want to go below, in my opinion, 21% critical chance, because then you start running into situations where you're not going to crit as much. But that's kind of where we're at as far as this one is. Now, the final tactical console we have is our Lorca's Fire Controllers. Now, one of the things that people criticized with the console is that it doesn't give an energy damage specific buff. So it doesn't give you the Cat 1 plus phaser that you see here on the Exploiters. But you don't really need it. It makes up for that in other ways, such as the 2-piece that it's going to grant with either the dual beam bank or the torpedo, in this case the torpedo. And it also gives you a very large amount of shield penetration. So this is going to give you a big critical chance boost and is essentially worth 2 locators worth of chance for you. It's also going to give you a nice bit of weapon power. Well, decent bit of weapon power, I should say. But the big draw to it, as far as just the console itself, is the huge amount of shield penetration it's going to give you. Now that 157.5 is going to translate to, and I'm sure some of my math guys will correct me if I'm wrong on this, I believe that comes out to about 16 to 18% critical, or not critical, but 16 to 18% shield penetration, somewhere in that range. Again, I'm sure the math guys will correct me on that if I'm wrong, but that's about where you're going to get from this. Touching base on the set bonuses really quickly, you can see the 2-piece bonus is a 1% critical severity buff for 20 seconds that can stack up to 25 times. And this is whenever you get a crit, you're going to get this. So if you're critting a lot, which you're probably going to do anyway with this build, then you're going to buff that. You're going to get this buff. So that's going to mean you're going to hit even that much harder once that's had time to build up. Now, for our science consoles, we have our Temporal Disentanglement Suite, which is going to give some crit chance and severity based on Ox, as well as a nice bit of shield capacity and a bit of shield resistance. For our supplemental subsystems, this is the console that actually comes with the ship, or the C-Store variant. It gives a little bit of power to all subsystems, and whenever you activate it, it gives you a very large boost of power to all of your subsystems. It's going to hit the attacker for a bit of electrical damage whenever they're shooting you. It's also going to debuff their power levels for a bit that can stack up to 20 times and buff yours. So potentially for a time, you're looking at up to, I believe it's 60 all power from this console for the duration. Then it can also do some electrical damage, or additional electrical damage to foes, and potentially do a disable. So it's a decent console, and I wanted to try it out just to see what all we could actually do with it. But yeah, that's what we have for our science consoles. Now getting into our engineering consoles. Now first up we have our regenerative integrity field, which is an oh crap I'm gonna die type of thing that comes from the Samsar. We feature it quite a bit here on the channel because of that reason. Now if you don't have access to the Samsar or some of these items, again, I can help you guys adjust the build as need be, and we can see what we can do for you. But if you do have access to it, it's going to give a very large heal up front, and as you're dealing damage with energy weapons, you're going to get that amount back in terms of healing. Now there is a minimum ceiling and a minimum, or there's a ceiling on the amount of damage you can restore from this, and a floor for the amount of damage that you can restore from this. So kind of a range it falls between. But generally, assuming you're getting all 5 procs per second for the maximum amount you can heal, this is going to be worth about 600,000 points of healing to you under the effect of this console. So yeah, like I say, it can be very, very good. Our Tachyokinetic Converter, which is another staple console, is going to give some turn rate, crit chance, and severity. Comes from our low-buy store and is basically an assimilated module and an RCS slammed into one thing. For Bioneural Infusion, it's going to give us our very large crit severity buff of 26.2%. Then we have our Protomatter Field Projector. Now this comes from the Dorito, and you now get this out of the Phoenix packs, I believe. And it gives some passive boosting to hull and shield restoration, and its benefit is a very large buff to your shield and hull regen while it's active, to you and anybody within 3 kilometers of you. So right now, from where I'm sitting, it's 365.8% shield regen and 340% hull regen. Now, those numbers are going to be improved by the shield and hull restoration skills. So this can be a very, very potent console. And I've seen in some instances in a defend the objective type situation, such as, say, the old Starbase Fleet Defense, whenever you can get one of those to pop. I've seen instances where people have healed that Starbase from nearly dead all the way back to full using this console, or the old Mirror event, whenever that was around. So it is a very good console to have, and is another oh crap I'm going to die type of thing. Then we have our Power Redistributor module. Now, for this type of console, this comes from our Atlas. And the good thing with our Redistributor module is the bonuses that it gives. Now, it gives some passive bonuses to damage resistance and a Category 1 buff. Now, for fed characters, this can be quite expensive, as you have to acquire it from the Atlas. But for other characters that may have access to it, it's a very nice console. Now, for this particular console, whenever you activate it, for 20 seconds, you get a plus 40% bonus energy weapon, or bonus damage, so it's across the board, not strictly energy. I misspoke there for a moment. And you get that while you're above 80% hull. If you dip below 80%, you lose that particular part of the bonus. But if you go back above 80%, you regain it. You get plus 100 bonus damage resistance rating. So you get a very large damage resistance rating while that's active, up to the cap of 75%. And it's also a plus 500% hull regen while it's active. So it can be used for very nice stuff offensively or defensively, depending on the situation you need. Then, finally, we have our singular hangar bay. Now, I don't like assuming what access people have to pets. I don't like to assume what kinds of pets people like to use. And for the most part, I tend to think of pets as personal preference. And if you have a particular kind of pet you like to use, then use it. But in my case, I'm using the Delta Flyers just because I think I get a lot more, or at least for the way I like to fly, I've gotten a lot more mileage out of the Delta Flyers than some of the others. But that's just my personal opinion on pets. You know, some options you have are the pets from the Disco Constitution, which are really great. And overall, it just depends on what you like and what you need. So that's what we have for our gear and our setup. Now let's get into our skills and everything else very quickly. Now for our skills, I'm using pretty much the standard build that I recommend on the channel. Now, for this particular character, I'm using a bit more into the impulse expertise, and I don't have anything into EPG. That's because on this character, I tend to fly a lot bigger, beefier ships. Otherwise, it's the same setup that I recommend on the channel. And I'm not going to get into why I picked the individual skill points. If you want to know why I picked certain skill points or didn't, I have that up here on the channel in the Tanking 101 playlist, which I encourage you guys to check out if you're interested in tanking or just want to get some more opinions on some of the finer aspects of tanking. Now, the one thing I do like to recommend is I always consider the threat control to be a mandatory thing if you're wanting to tank, because that is free threat generation that you get just by picking it. As far as your specializations go, now you have some options here. The first and foremost thing that I always recommend tanks to pick up is Strategist, because of the diversionary tactics. That's essentially going to give you a nice AoE taunt in space if you need to pick up a group of enemies quickly, and it also gives you a slight threat buff while it's active. So, potentially allowing you to taunt off of teammates and pick up threat when you need it, along with the other benefits that it gives. Now, for primary specializations, there's two that I typically recommend to people. The first of which is Miracle Worker. And Miracle Worker is going to give you some nice benefits in the damage recovery department, and some bits of damage negation. Now, the other one is going to be your, if I can find it in the list here, is your Intel. Now, Intel gives a bit of defense rating, but it gives more damage oriented and threat generation type abilities than some of the others do. Now, as far as to which one is going to be best for you is going to depend on where you're at with your threat generation and your survival portions of the build. If you think you have enough built-in damage recovery and damage negation, then you might lean more towards Intel for some extra threat generation it can give you. On the opposite end of that coin, if you think you need some more damage recovery or damage negation, then you're going to want to go with Miracle Worker. Both of them have some good benefits, and that's typically the two that I recommend. Now, for our traits. Now, a lot of our traits, in my opinion, for personal space are going to be kind of self-explanatory. Let's go ahead and look at our tactical career-specific ones. We have Last Ditch Effort. Whenever we activate Go Down Fighting, which is a tactical career-specific ability, we get some damage resistance while it's active. Then our other one is our Good Day to Die, which basically lets us use go down fighting at any time and at any hull capacity. So these two are career specific to tacticals. If you're not a tactical officer but you want to use the build, I'll help you guys adjust accordingly. But for the most part, just stick your own career specifics in there and you should be good. The next traits we have are Superior Beam Training for free beam damage, Elusive for free defense value making the ship harder to hit, Point Blank Shot for a Category 2 damage boost the closer we are to the target, up to a certain maximum, Fleet Coordinator for free damage based on how many people are in the team, which can be very good. Then we have Beam Barrage, which is our R&D crafting trait that we're utilizing because it's going to help buff our beam damage even more, which is going to translate to free threat. Now, I used Terran targeting systems for this build because I wanted a bit more crit severity in this particular setup. It's going, getting tongue-tied a little bit. It's going to give 15% crit severity for free, just by having it slotted, and incoming critical hits reduce your speed by 10% for 5 seconds, max once in 15 seconds. So every once in a while they can slow you down very slightly, but not for long, so that's worth the trade-off in my opinion. The final two traits we have are Repair Cruise for some free damage resistance and a whole repair rate. While in combat, gain 1 stack of Repair Cruise every 5 seconds, up to 5, and then this is worth potentially up to 25 damage resistance and 25% hull repair rate. So, very nice to have. Then finally, we have our Context is for Kings. Now, Context is for Kings is a very good trait. If you did not take damage in the past second, plus 3 all damage resistance rating. If you did not take damage, or if you did take it, you get the damage resistance. If you did not take damage, you get a bonus Category 2 all damage for 10 seconds. So either they give you more resistance to their damage, or they give you damage to kick them in the face that much harder. Either way, you win. Now for our, I'm going to touch base on our reputations really quickly, our space reps, then I'm going to come back to Starship traits because these are basically stat sticks. Precision for free critical hit chance, advanced target systems for free critical severity, Tyler's Duality for the free critical chance based on your hull capacity, and Magnified Firepower for the free Cat 2 damage boosting. These are going to help buff your threat. Then finally, your Energy Refrequencer, which is going to heal you for a very nice chunk of your energy damage as long as you are shooting. And the more heals and stuff you have, the higher that's going to be. And I have seen Energy Refrequencer over the course of a run out-heal even the Kobali and other similar consoles. For active reps, I like to think of them as personal preference, but I've got a good bit of damage and shenanigans out of the Quantum Singularity Manipulation, which is going to buff your science stats for the duration and give you a temporary cloak. Anti-Time Entanglement for a nice little AoE kick in the pants and slow to foes. Also functions as a zero distance power, basically meaning as far as the enemy is concerned, the source of damage is right on top of them, therefore it's going to generate slightly more threat. Then finally, Biomolecular Shield Generator for some free shield regeneration while you're inside it, as well as some shield damage resistance. Now for our Starship traits. Now, since we're going to be running as a tank, we're going to be using Attack Pattern Delta Prime. Or not Attack Pattern Delta Prime, but Attack Pattern Delta. The trait is called Delta Prime. And in addition to the other benefits of our Attack Pattern Delta, this is going to give us potentially up to 15% critical chance and 37.5% severity while Delta is active, and once this stacks up to 10 times. So that's additional free threat generation. Our redirecting arrays is going to extend our fire at will duration while we're getting shot, potentially up to 15 additional seconds. Then we have our History Will Remember, which is, once it stacks up, worth up to 30% all damage, 30% hull regen, 30% additional maximum HP, and up to 300% threat generation while we're in threatening stance. So if you're not a tank, then you're probably not going to get as much out of this trait because it requires you to get hit in order for it to stack up. Then we have our emergency weapon cycle, which is going to reduce our weapon power cost by 50% for 30 seconds and give 20% firing cycle haste for 30 seconds as well. Then we also have our weapon emitter overdrive from the Juggernaut, and whenever using a beam or cannon bridge officer power, it increases weapon power drain by 50%, gives us 10% critical chance for directed energy weapons, and 50 accuracy rating. Now, one thing I will say is I realize not everybody's going to have access to a Juggernaut. Again, I'll help people adjust as need be. But for those people that do, if you're using emergency weapon cycle and emitter overdrive at the same time, whenever both of them activate, the weapon power cost enhancements are going to cancel each other out, but you'll still be left with the other benefits, such as the crit chance, the accuracy, and the firing cycle haste. So you've got good benefits there. Now we're going to touch base on our duty officers really quickly, look at our buffs really quickly, and then we're going to get moved on into our runs finally. Now as far as our duty officers go, now I like to have one of the ones that gives a bit of critical severity for whenever we're firing energy weapons. We also have the emergency con duty officer. Now, this guy comes from the Phoenix boxes. You can pick him up, and whenever you activate emergency power to engines, you recharge your evasive maneuvers a good bit, and can even outright reset the cooldown whenever you're using this guy. Next, we have ZMOC, which is going to be a 15% cooldown reduction to our attack patterns, which is going to be very nice. Now, there's other variants of him that exist out there now, so you don't have to have ZMOC specifically, but he is probably, I would dare say, the most well-known of the bunch. Next, we have 2 copies of our Adaku-Kan, and this is going to enhance our attack pattern delta quite a bit more. And essentially, since we have 2 of this guy, we get twice the benefit. So whenever we're activating our delta, both of these guys are going to go off and give us up to 200% additional threat generation for free. So between History Will Remember, Threatening Stance, and Attract Fire, and these 2 guys, you're looking at close to, that'd be 900% threat generation between them. I had to add the number up in my head for a moment. Now, the final duty officer I have equipped at the moment is a reverse shield polarity duty officer that increases the duration of reverse shield polarity. Now, the one I used for recording was actually one that could give me additional power on use of emergency power abilities. But I kind of forgot to switch this chick back off for the recording here. Now, touching base on our powers that we have. Now, our tactical setup is pretty standard for a tank, in my opinion. We have our tactical team to redistribute our shields automatically. We have our Delta, which is going to be enhanced by Delta Prime as well as the DOFs. Now, the reason we want to use attack pattern Delta is for the benefits that it gives you as a tank. Whenever something shoots you, so looking at the rank 1 version of the power, you get a plus 30 all damage resistance rating for 15 seconds, and enemies that shoot you debuff themselves for a minus 30 all damage resistance rating for 5 seconds, and that duration is going to refresh with each hit. So they buff you against their damage and debuff themselves against your damage. We have Fire at Will as our beam enhancement, which is going to let us smack anything in range with a beam. Still, in my opinion, the better power out of the beam enhancements for gathering AoE threat very quickly. Then we have our Torpedo Spread, if the tooltip will load, for launching several torpedoes at different targets. Then we have, for our science powers, our science team to recharge the shields a bit and purge subnucleonic type of science debuffs. We have our hazard emitters for the heal over time, the slight damage reduction that it gives, and the debuff purging that it's going to give. For our engineering powers, we have our engineering team to heal our hull a bit, purge viral matrix type of effects and engineering debuffs, emergency power to engines to pop our emergency condoff, and also a get the heck out of dodge type of thing. We have emergency power to weapons 3 for the bonus energy damage it gives, as well as the buffs to weapon power and our traits that it can also set off. Reverse shield polarity for recharging our shields in a pinch based off of incoming energy damage, which is always very nice. For our command powers, we have Overwhelm Emitters to basically leech shield power, or leech shield health off of targets, and buff our own. Rally Point Marker for the shield and hull restoration it gives while active. Now it says it removes all debuffs, but there are a few that it does not. So that tooltip is slightly wrong at the moment, but that is something to keep in mind. Then finally we have a very large damage reducing ability, which is the Suppression Barrage. It debuffs outgoing damage by 20%, flight turn rate and flight speed by 33.3, and accuracy rating by 25 to whoever or whatever it hits. So that can help reduce your damage. Now we're going to take a minute, we're going to do our Beta Thoradar and our Chipori runs, and we're going to see how the ship performed, and then we're going to come back and do some final thoughts and analysis. But for now, folks, we will be right back. And as we wait for this epic loading screen, folks, our resident wolf of Clan Timber was kind enough to join us for this.
How's it going, guys?
So, we went over our tank build in an earlier part of the video here. Timberwolf, I believe, is testing for another series on his channel, which I believe is a player-submitted build, if I'm not mistaken. Yep. So, you guys will get to see a little bit of that. That is the Gagarin, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep,
good
the
sir?
Fleet Gagarin. I actually have a soft spot for this ship.
Alright, let's see what we can do here. Well, that explains why that key wasn't working. Evasive maneuvers disappeared off my bar.
Yeah, that's not good.
No, that is not good at all. In case folks are curious, I do use that to get into position from time to time. So, making sure that is on the bar is actually a pretty big deal. I hate it when that happens. don't you just love when you go to fire a lance weapon and it decides, oh hey, I'm going to miss both shots?
Yeah.
So, went a little slower than what we're used to, but I kind of expected that with this particular build.
I expected the same with this player-created build. It's decent, but it's a little clunky. The purpose of this series is more testing exactly what the player submits as their build, seeing how it works, and then how I might adjust it to make it better. It's a little clunky, but at least it's working.
So, for folks over on my channel, and I know you're going to see more of this when we go to our Japori, because that's typically where our videos overlap. But for folks on my channel that may want to know a little bit more and may wish to submit a build for that, since we do a lot of cross stuff, what would you say to people on that one?
If they want to submit to this, I just need an STO Academy page or something similar with everything that is in your build. Skill tree, duty officers, bridge officers, the powers, the traits, what ship, all the gear. Submit me literally every detail about your build, and I'll recreate it exactly as is, and we'll test it out using our normal ship review runs.
Alrighty, and are there any restrictions as far as that goes that they should be made aware of?
Negative. Pretty much, if it's the ship that you're flying, and that's the build you're using, then we're good. Don't submit things that you're just trying to see, oh, well, I record it because I submitted this. I actually want your legitimate builds, which you're actually using. Not something you threw into the Academy Builder because you want to see if I can make it work. What you legit use.
Alrighty. You heard it from the man himself there, folks. Don't think they like me very good. Alrighty, so a little bit slower than what we might normally do in here, but that's the name of the game sometimes with Beta Thoradar, but both ships held up rather well, I like to think.
Yeah, I'd say so.
So, we're going to take a minute, folks. We're going to come back. We're going to do our Japori run. We're going to parse that out, go over some of the numbers for the tank side of things. Timber's going to go over the numbers for this build over on his channel, and we're going to see what we can come up with for you folks.
Of course, we have an epic loading screen. As always, when we're here on Tribble, my good buddy Darkblade has joined me. I filled him in on what this first video in this playlist is, so he's going to kind of help with the breakdown and some of the enhancements, that kind of thing, especially when it comes down to diminishing returns. It's a nasty little beast, but let's first jump in. I believe he's got his Galaxy Dreadnought. It's time to test Japori Elite.
See what kind of shenanigans we can't get into.
And this is probably going to be slower than your average Japori Elite because, well, I mainly said it's not going to be as pretty as we normally do.
For folks over on Timber's channel, I'm actually, another reason it's going to be going a little slower is this is leaning more towards the survival side of the spectrum, and I hear a doggy toy.
Yeah, nothing I can do about that.
That's all good. Yeah, so this one leads a bit more towards the survival side of the spectrum, and It's more of the threat tank type of thing I mentioned on my channel. So we're both a little bit not really sure what the proper wording would be here. I guess more towards the survival side of things.
As long as you keep me alive in this thing. So this is all new to me.
Well, we gonna live. I just can't guarantee they gonna live. Next group should be coming in momentarily. Wait, nope, we got one more ship.
Yep, I think I just popped a gravity well in their normal spot. I don't know how I targeted the ground like that, but very strange.
There they are. Gravity well is just slightly off, but otherwise, good to go. Rally point is active.
I think we're doing alright though. I think this build is holding up fairly well, and it's just not how I would exactly build the ship, but so the next section of this video is talking about how I would modify this to get a little bit more out of it.
Both holding up pretty good. Say a little slower than what we're used to, but again, it's getting the job done, so that's the important bit.
And we're in elite, so it's definitely getting the job done.
Oh yeah. And another rally point is active.
You know what? I don't like y'all.
Oh, what was that? Lance him in the face. Okay.
Increase my power a little bit.
What's that? Throw down a fall on him? Okay.
Alright, last ship.
I'm done saying knock you out.
Alright. Definitely a slower run than what we're used to. But let's see what shenanigans happened anyway, because normally, even when we do weird builds, the oddity build series, and proof in the pudding on that one. Of course, I'm going to go through all these logs. There's so many logs. There it is.
Yeah, we test a lot of crap if y'all haven't figured that out yet.
I have to go through this folder. That's what I need to do. Because there's also multiple folders I have to go through. That's always lovely. Okay. We have a drum roll. And the guy that submitted this, his name is Vincent. Vincent, an elite difficulty Japori. Your build handled 98.36k. Blade doing 60.21k as the tank. Crit chance of your build was averaging about 53.26%, and we had a max one hit of 83k, and looking at the damage chart, it's actually pretty consistent. So let me see here. For damage output, and this is under exceeded rated limits, which was your top damage ability. Phaser arrays, we're doing 14.1k, with the Terran Task Force doing 11. Then you get to Fire at Will 3, doing 8.6. Listing a beam array at 7.2. I mean, you're doing decent here with what we've got here. So, I mean, the build actually did pretty nice, all things considered. And a target debuff of 52%. And I'll give this to Blade for his threat, because that build that he was testing took in 88% of the attacks with 86% of the damage. So he definitely had the threat in that one. My healing out accounted for 1.9% of all the healing in the run, whereas his accounted for 98%, so I really didn't have to heal that much.
Alrighty folks, now that we're back from our Beta Thoradar and our Japori runs, we're going to go ahead and get into our combat analysis and final thoughts. Now, I have to say, I think the ship held up rather well for what we threw at her. Now, it wasn't our fastest runs ever, due to the nature of what all was being tested, but I think we did pretty good. She held up rather well. I don't think we were ever in any super serious danger of dying, but it got the job done, and for a elite mission, can't really complain too much. So, let's go ahead and bring in our damage meter from off screen here. So you can see here how the damage breakdown went. It ended up being about just a hair over 5 minutes. So a little bit slower than what we're used to, but overall did pretty good. You can see the damage breakdown was about 98k for Timber, and just a hair over 59k for us, which is actually pretty good considering. As far as total attacks in, damage in, that sort of stuff, you could see we took most of the damage. We also took in 88.43% of the threat, so almost 89% of the threat. We also did most of the healing in that run, so Timber didn't really have to worry too much. But I know he was also helping a viewer of his channel kind of test out some bits of the build. So overall, off camera, based on conversations, seems that everything did good. But overall, as far as our stuff went, for total attacks in, we definitely did our job. We had nearly 89% of the threat, the exact number being 88.43%. So we were definitely doing great in that department. Now, moving in our combat analysis report from off screen here, you can see how kind of our breakdowns went. You can see our advanced phasers, pretty much everything under fire at will is where most of our damage was coming from. You can see the advanced phaser arrays, our pets did a little bit, our pulse phasers, and you can just kind of see how everything broke down in that department. Now, as far as the numbers up here, you can kind of see how everything went, our DPS, heals per second, how much threat we were putting out. Then, whoops, wrong tab. Still wrong tab. And healing abilities. Alright, so you can see the breakdown of how our healing went and just exactly what everything came from. Now, our energy refrequencer, you can see how that went. That was actually our top healing ability over time, doing almost 1,450 points of healing a second, which is actually pretty darn good. You can see some of the healing that our pets did, which I believe that may count the rally point marker as part of the healing, since it's technically something we launch out. I'm not 100% sure on that, but let's actually see. Healing abilities, pets. Yep, it counts our, that's what I thought, it counts our rally point marker as some of the healing that it does, so that makes sense. Now, for the rest of the stuff, you can just kind of see how it broke down. It just kind of went down the list from there. But overall, the ship held up rather well, I thought. It's still a pretty nasty little beast for what I like her to do in-game. And overall, if you're looking for a ship that is going to do you well as a tank, in my personal opinion, if I had to recommend a ship to get started with, I would say this is one of the ones that would be kind of high up on the list. So if you like a hero ship to tank with, this is one I'm highly going to encourage, just because of how well it did. But overall, I have no complaints. I think the Galaxy X, and specifically the Yamato, still holds up rather well. But overall, yeah, you're going to get a good ship if you go with her. So, until next time, folks, this is Captain Blade J52, signing off.